Welcome, Duke alumni and friends, to this session of the Duke Alumni Forever Learning Institute, an interdisciplinary educational program organized in a set of thematic courses. I'm Jo Supernaw, Director of Academic Engagement with Alumni Engagement and Development, and I'm really excited for you to join us today with our program, Politics of Water, Equity at Half Empty or Half Full. Moderating our discussion is Erika Weinthal, Professor of Environmental Policy and Public Policy with the Nicholas School of the Environment. Welcome to the Forever Learning Institute, Erika.
Thank you, Jo. I'm Erika Weinthal. As Jo said, I'm from the Nicholas School of the Environment at Duke. I am a scholar who works on water a great deal of the time. And I want to welcome everyone here today. We're a week early. Next week, it happens to be World Water Day. So this is a great way to get us ready to think about water, especially during the month of March. I have to say, I've been thinking about water a lot because my work focuses on water and conflict. And I have been watching with great concern what has been happening in the war in Ukraine over the last few weeks, where water has come under fire. And a lot of my research really looks at what happens when you target water infrastructure in war. And in the Ukraine, what we've been seeing is thousands of people being left without water, left without sanitation because of constant shelling and bombardment, and the need to protect civilian infrastructure, to essentially protect civilians, their security, and their access to water. And a lot of what we're going to be talking about today has to do with expanding access to water and ensuring that populations across the world have access to clean water and sanitation. So with that, I'm going to start by turning to our virtual panelists and to have them introduce themselves. But first, I will just note who we have with us today, and then I will let them go introduce themselves in the order that I read their names. First, we have Michele Okoh, who's a senior lecturing fellow in the Duke Law School. Then we have Andrew Jones, who is an assistant professor of civil and environmental engineering. And last, we have Marc Jeuland, who is an associate professor in the Sanford School of Public Policy. And what you should see already is that we have a very interdisciplinary group. So we will have broad perspectives on thinking about access to water and the politics of water today. So with that, Michele?
Yes, thank you. As mentioned, I'm a senior lecturing fellow with the Duke Environmental Law and Policy Clinic, and I'm also a member of the American Public Health Association. I won the Rebecca A. Head Award and am co-chair of the Environmental Justice Committee. And that is what really kind of drives my work currently, environmental justice. Specifically, I'm working on a paper entitled Forgotten Water that focuses on well-dependent communities. Those are communities whose only source of water is in relation to well water, not public water systems. And specifically, I focus on what are called municipally underbound communities. These are communities that are not incorporated, but are near municipalities. And I look at their access to water.
Thank you. Andrew?
Sure. Thanks for the introduction. So I'm Andrew Jones, a new assistant professor in civil and environmental engineering with affiliate appointments in both the integrated toxicology program as well as the Duke Materials Initiative and the mechanical engineering and materials science department. So I wear a lot of hats, but that's because my work generally focuses on using engineering and policy analysis tools to address U.S. problems in water and health. And so what that means is that we look at either developing new technologies to treat water, or how those new technologies are going to actually be implemented to improve equity of access to clean, safe drinking water.
Great. Marc?
Thanks. My name is Marc Jeuland. Delighted to be part of this panel and participating with you. I identify as an environmental economist, and my work is broadly focused at the intersection of environmental and international development topics. So I mostly examine individual and institutional behaviors through the lens of economics, but I do collaborate widely with a range of scholars from other disciplines in the natural, social, health, and engineering sciences. I work mostly these days on water and energy. And within water resources, there are two main broad areas that I work in. The first is really at the micro level, understanding household behaviors and responses to water supply and water quality interventions, especially in low-income settings and countries, and really trying to identify what types of interventions are effective and when they're effective and why. And then the second area is on the implications of large-scale infrastructure and management interventions in transboundary water resource systems. So thinking both about the impacts of those interventions, broadly speaking, on a variety of different kinds of outcomes, but also distributionally on different parties that might be affected by the infrastructure. So I'll be happy to talk about some examples of that as we go forward.
Terrific. As everyone can see, this is a really diverse group of panelists that have, wide-ranging expertise when it comes to thinking about expanding access to water and issues of justice and inequity. And that's where I really want to start this conversation today, especially, given that we have expertise here that is both domestic, U.S. focused, at the very local level, all the way up to the interstate level. And we, globally, we've spent a lot of time talking about the Millennium Development Goals, Sustainable Development Goals, especially Sustainable Development Goal 6 in expanding access to water globally. But often what people forget is that there are large numbers of people in the United States who don't have access to clean water and proper sanitation. And so with that, I want to have our panelists start with just talking about what does justice mean in your work? What does it mean to address different forms of inequities? And just, provide some illustrations and examples of, what this means in your everyday practice and scholarship. And maybe I'll go in reverse this time. I will start with Marc, then Andrew, and then Michele.
Sure. Thanks, Erika. So I'll start a bit general in terms of how I think about justice overlapping with my work, and then give a couple of examples. So, broadly speaking, I think one entry point here is thinking about inequality, and inequality as being really a defining characteristic of almost all social systems. Some such systems are more unequal than others, however. So you could have varying levels of that type of inequality. And the extent of that inequality typically stems from a combination of historical factors, as well as current valuations of the things that society places value on, and that economies place value on. So the ability to produce those things that are valuable and derive value as people comes a lot from endowments, which are kind of historical allocations of resources. And those differences in endowments, they can be deeply felt. They can come from longstanding structural issues in society, and they can accumulate, but they can also erode over time. So I tend to think about full justice in this frame as really correcting for or compensating for damages that are really engendered by inequalities of opportunity. And these inequalities of opportunity can be quite pervasive. At the same time, though, I'm an economist, and I think that it's always important to acknowledge that there's an important trade-off between sort of addressing those inequalities, so improving equity on the one hand, and efficiency, which is sort of producing the maximum value for society overall well-being. And so in simple terms, this arises because individuals generally try to maximize their own well-being, and that can often lead to situations that harm other people and lead to more inequality. So with that kind of general frame, maybe a couple of specific dilemmas that I've recently confronted in the water space. and worked on that relate to this. So one question that I've spent a lot of my career working on is conflict over water resources and sharing of water resources in the Nile Basin. And in the Nile Basin, there are lots of plentiful water resources, but there are many interests and many different countries that want to utilize those resources. Recently, some of you may have heard about the fact that Ethiopia is constructing a very large dam, a new hydropower project on the Blue Nile. And there are concerns, particularly in Egypt, in the downstream country, that the operation of this dam will lead to damages for Egyptians who depend on the Nile because it's a very arid country. So the dilemma that has come up and which really stymies discussions or a resolution in this particular case is the question of whether Ethiopia should compensate Egypt for damages that might stem from operation and construction of this dam when it tries to maintain its hydropower production. But on the flip side, Ethiopia asks a different question, and their question is, well, shouldn't Egypt compensate us for allowing them to mitigate their droughts by releasing water in a different way, such that they can use that to mitigate droughts? And one's view on which of these solutions is just depends on where you sit. So the two countries in their very contentious negotiations come from very different assumptions about who is right or what is the just starting point. And it really stems from these differences over historical endowments and what people think they should have access to and what they have property rights to. Okay, so a second example is from my microsphere. And this is in the context of access to safe and clean drinking water. There are lots of solutions that exist to provide clean drinking water to everybody on a global scale. But these solutions are often expensive. They require resources. And some of the people who are least able to access them have low levels of resources. So the justice question that comes up is who should pay for these solutions when the direct beneficiaries themselves may not be able to afford those solutions. And the answer to that question, again, depends on the context that we're considering and what starting point you come from. So the what is just might be a different answer if we're thinking about rural Andhra Pradesh in India, where by and large, many people are poor and there's a difficulty bringing in new resources compared to a situation such as rural Alabama or rural North Carolina, where it's a relatively small fraction of the population that doesn't have access. And there are very different reasons for those historical differences in access. I'll stop there for now.
Terrific, Marc. It's also great to have you bring in the variation, not just between domestic and international, but urban and rural water supply and access. Andrew?
Sure. So I guess to answer the question very, very, very simply, justice in my work really looks like everyone knowing that their water is safe and never having to balance water needs versus other health needs, right? So that's a very simplified view, but from a technological standpoint, there are a number of challenges and questions that we can start asking and answering. Part of that, of course, stemmed from the Flint water crisis. When that happened, it was a question of safety and who knew what information at what time, right? And so when that crisis happened, places that had access to high technology, easy access to being able to measure water quality. So for example, I think it was a GM plant. They were able to measure the quality of their water instantly, right? They had the capacity, they have I'll go out and say it. They had the mass spectrometers, which are instruments that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to measure how much lead is in their water, or lead, acids, right? They could say, here's the full spectrum of this water, and I know that I need to be back on Detroit water. And they were able to get switched back to Detroit water, as opposed to Flint. The majority of the citizens there had to stay on Flint River water. And then they had to go and eventually figure out connections with, let's say, Marc Edwards at Virginia Tech, with Mona, whose last name I forgot right now, but who was a public health worker within the city, public health doctor within the state of Michigan. They were able to connect with those two people and eventually advocate for switching over. Of course, it took them years, right? We all lived through that crisis that was happening in Flint. We watched it on the news, rather, and that was really a lack of access to information, a lack of being able to prove that they need to switch off, right? The fact that the auto industry was able to switch immediately, whereas the people that were drinking it couldn't, that was problematic in my mind from a technological standpoint. And so what we work on in my lab is trying to develop new sensors that will allow everyday people to access the quality of their water data at a similar level to what you can get out of measuring your water quality data. At a more local level, at a kind of a more personal level, I'll pick a city that I just moved from. So I just moved here from Boston. I was a professor at Northeastern University. And in the city of Boston, you have to privately contract out to get your water quality measured, right? So that is, you have to pay somebody to measure your water quality. It used to be done by the Public Health Service within the city of Boston, but they realized it was cost ineffective. Within the city of Cambridge, you can do that, right? You can just send your water off to the the Cambridge Water Department, and they will tell you what's in your water. And then you'll be able to figure out whether it's your house's plumbing or the city's plumbing that's a problem, why you have bad quality water. And they will do that for free, right? It's part of your taxpayer dollars. And the demographics of Cambridge look drastically different from the demographics of Boston, right? As far as wealth, education, income, race, class, like those demographics look very different. And that is, again, it's an access to information problem and access to health data. And people are concerned. People are drinking water. They know that the water in the public schools in the city of Boston are bad. Like that is a known documented thing within the city of Boston. You can't drink the water if you walk into a public school there. You're just not supposed to do it, right? And so if we're trying to figure out how to trying to really pursue justice within the United States, this is a major city issue that's happening. We need new sensors. We need new technology. We've tried to push this a couple times. So the Safe Drinking Water Act mandated that we are supposed to give annually water quality information if you are served by a water utility to every single person. You probably got one in the mail. Whether or not you've read it is a different story. Whether or not you know how to act on it is another story, right? So you're supposed to get the information, then act on the information, hopefully fund better infrastructure and get a better outcome, right? Get justice, seek justice, right? That was the hope. That hasn't happened, and so we're trying to figure out new methods of doing that.
Great. And thanks for touching on the Safe Drinking Water Act, because I think it's a great segue, probably to Michele, because also for those of us like at my house, we actually have a private well, so we're not regulated by the Safe Drinking Water Act. And it, the testing falls upon us if we want to know what's in our drinking water. So I think, Michele, as from a legal perspective, you might have something to say there.
Yes. And, that's one of the concerns in regards to water access. One of the issues that we have to think about is how easy it is for us not to think about these large segments of the United States populations that does not have access to safe drinking water. You mentioned that you utilize a well. Well, that's 15%. Approximately 43 million Americans who are responsible for maintaining whether or not they have safe drinking water. That means they don't have access to municipal water systems. They don't have regulation under the Safe Drinking Water Act, as Andrew just mentioned, that really sets standards for what is safe for us to consume. But not only that, also as Andrew mentioned, there's a significant issue in regards to even those who are utilizing public water systems, right? And actually being able to access safe drinking water. And what we are seeing is that there are huge inequities in that regard. And that is both for our well water communities and also for our communities that are relying on public water systems. I focus specifically on these well-dependent communities because I think they have a tendency to be greatly overlooked in the literature and in our conversation, be ultimately forgotten. We have this idea that in the United States that we have near universal access to safe drinking water. And that is not the case. We have significant proportions of our population who don't have that type of access. We have almost 500,000 households who lack complete plumbing. And then even with those systems that are on the public water system, 1,165 are in violation of the Safe Drinking Water Act. And this is not evenly distributed. We're talking about justice. So what we are seeing is that our communities that are BIPOC communities are more likely to be impacted by these issues in relation to access. And, I have a tendency to approach things from a legal perspective. I also approach them from a public health perspective. And really what this comes down to is an issue of public health and really the structural determinants of public health. And when I say the structural determinants of public health, what I really mean are those policies, institutions, and the cultural norms that create the conditions of which we have these health inequities rooted in power. It's rooted in how resources are distributed throughout our society. And the important thing to realize when we talk about these structural determinants is that they can be addressed. We can do something about them, right? Because I was talking about our policy, our institutions, how resources are distributed throughout our societies. These are all things that we as a society can make a decision as far as how we will address them. However, we have a tendency to ignore them. And we know that from a public health standpoint, racism itself is a public health crisis. And when we look at these communities as far as water access is concerned, that is very much so underlying it. And these communities have been described as various other different names in literature. So peri-urban. I mentioned municipally underground. Daniel Purifoy, who also, studied here at Duke, called them shadow towns. And part of that is because when I use all these terms, what I'm really talking about are communities that are outside of municipalities, but at the same time, they're not incorporated. They do not have the same access to infrastructure that those cities have. So they are missing, if we're talking about politics, they're missing an entire unit of government to provide them with the resources they need. Not only that, going into the legacy of municipal underbounding, these communities settled in patterns that was rooted in our history in regards to segregation. And those racial dynamics still relate to whether or not they are incorporated and are given resources. So when I think about what does justice look like, it means us actually opening up our eyes and actually calling for action to be taken in regards to the structural determinants of health, and not just to place Band-Aids upon the issues we have, but actually to look at the underlying causes, which is unfortunately also much usually connected to our legacy of racism.
Thank you. I want to also note that we have a chat opened. I don't know if the Q&A is open, but we would welcome questions from all of you in the audience that we will be able to answer as part of this, round table on Zoom and our panel on Zoom. I really appreciate all these comments and laying out what justice means to each of you in your own fields. And often I feel we're very good at problematizing what we see as, challenges to, expanding access to water in a just and equitable manner. And I wonder if it's possible to provide some insights into what would be solutions. What would we need to do from your different perspectives to actually address these different challenges, everything from technological to addressing structural racism, to different interests and power asymmetries in an international river basin. And so I'm going to start with Andrew this time, if you don't object. And then I will go to Michele and then Marc, just to keep things moving around. And again, please send your questions our way too.
So I guess to start, like, what the thing that got me into this research was I was, in theory, coming up with solutions to this problem. Like that is, as an engineer by training, that was the goal was, okay, we create this new sensor and it's going to solve problem X, right? We create this new technology and it's going to solve problem Y. Like that was the goal. What we found out is that for the most part, a lot of those technological solutions, the barrier to those being implemented and actually being used is on the policy side more than it is on the existence of a material artifact of technology. So when we really started trying to drill down into it, we said, okay, at the very least, one of the policies that we might be able to implement would be something like a water smart grid. So we borrowed language from the electrical smart grid world and said, if something is distributed, it is distributed in its generation, distributed in its treatment, distributed in its sensing, and distributed in its regulation, then we might be able to get a more give power back to the people to make their own decisions in one sense, right? So being able to say, hey, I have these resources, I have water that I can sell back to the grid, or I have water that I can store for the cases where the grid doesn't have water. That was a solution that we kind of stumbled on through looking at the electrical smart grid lens. Some of the challenges to that are, of course, those people that can't afford to implement their own systems. How do we make sure that they get those and get the access to resources in a way that would allow them to have those? The other challenges are, of course, on the regulatory side, where our current existing regulatory framework does not allow for water from let's say, your house to go back into the system, right? That would raise all sorts of red flags within the Safe Drinking Water Act, among other places, right? So being able to do that is, again somewhat challenging. But it is really rethinking the way in which we operate infrastructure, because right now the way we operate infrastructure is we put in and plan for infrastructure to last for 100 years for a fixed population in a fixed place. And populations change. We could not have predicted the rise of the silicon economy 100 years ago. That was not on anybody's mind 100 years beforehand, right? And yet that has transformed the way in which we use water. If you look at Texas, if you look at Arizona, they have these very high water using industries that need pure water, and that's going to take water away from the agricultural sectors. That's going to take water away from people that need to drink water, right? And so those changes need to shift. Now, that doesn't really address the two problems that Michele and Marc brought up of kind of the people that were still on the fringe, on the outskirts of society, that have been pushed to the margins of society, the marginalized, the historically marginalized populations. It does not fix that unless we can really fix the way in which policies are implemented, right? We could implement and say, we're going to have a water smart grid, but that water smart grid will probably still go to the people that can afford to build a water smart grid, just the same way that the electrical smart grid, solar panels go to the people that have resources to put solar panels on their house. And those were probably not the people that were facing blackouts in the first place. This also has a potential for problems. So if we think about some of the challenges with data privacy that were existing with the electrical smart grid, those same issues are happening within the water smart grid. A lovely case in point when somebody implemented the first piece of a smart grid, which is just measuring how much water you're using in real time. They were able to use that. I believe it was England was able to use that to prove a case that somebody murdered their wife because they were using high excess water at a time period where they normally were not, right? Which on the one hand we could see is good, but on the other hand, that could also out somebody who's housing people in their house, quote unquote, illegally, right? So that's some of the issues that we have to start worrying about when we start implementing this system. Is not only will it still exacerbate inequalities probably, but it will also open up an entire new realm of privacy issues.
Thank you. Michele?
Yes. Whenever we're talking about systemic changes, it is always challenging. You have to deal with societal willpower and also an acknowledgement that a problem actually exists. I really appreciate what Andrew was saying about the challenges in relation to technology and then finding out that that's not supported by policy. That is 100% correct. What we need here is policy change. And that's on several levels. In the United States, we do not acknowledge a human right to water in this country. That's something that needs to change and will shift the way that we look at water access. In the United States, as far as it comes to issues of race, as recently as Shelby, in regards to that was a Supreme Court case in, I believe, 2015, where pre-clearance from the Voting Rights Act was essentially struck down because it was seen as no longer needed. Realize that we still do actually have a problem with race in this country is, a very significant aspect of what we do for policy. Even with President Biden's Justice 40 program, that right there for that framework, it was recently released that race is not going to be considered as a factor. So that has to, that would be a rude awakening, but I think it is something that this country needs to deal with and needs to address as far as realizing that there are inequities that exist. I think also another aspect is realizing, the role and the power. And I appreciate Marc earlier talking about how significant power is. There's power over, power to, power with, but really getting away from a system where we are focusing on power as really being competitive. And that has happened in the circumstance of water, where it's only seen where one group that gets it and the other group doesn't, not really focusing on the sharing of resources. But instead, the shift needs to be on policies that support empowering communities and sharing of resources, as opposed to a winner takes all approach. I think that's, a very important aspect to consider. And even looking at the recent, infrastructure bill, one of the things that I was looking at is, in relation to kind of the gaps that exist with these well-dependent communities that are, municipally underbound. They fall through a lot of those gaps, just in part because I think it's very hard for us to accept that history, and still impacts us today. But also, also looking at the structure of it and looking at areas such as broadband, right? And look at how we approach electrification, right? So all of those, there's a big emphasis on cooperatives, but there are water cooperatives in this country. There are a few of them, but even looking at the infrastructure bill, that is not front and center. That is, when it talks about broadband, it has all these protections for cooperatives, right? That focuses on communities really having more of a power in how money will be distributed to them. Because one of the things I mentioned, right, we're talking about municipally underbound communities. So they're missing a whole level of government, and it's up to essentially the county government to decide whether or not they have access to these grants that are available. But if there's the cooperative nature, right, as we see, for example, with the organization of broadbands, that instead puts those communities at the center of what happens with that money and how it could be utilized to increase their water infrastructure. So I think that's also a very important aspect that we have to take into consideration, how to actually empower communities. And when I say empower, I mean giving them the resources. These communities already have power, but actually giving them the tools to be able to achieve those goals. And I think that also needs to be front and center in the policy that we have. And that will look different to different communities, but the example of protecting the cooperative model in the area of rural water I think is an important step.
Great. Thanks. So I guess, in terms of answering the question of solutions, I would start with, I guess, what I think are the two main barriers, which echo a lot of what Michele just said, but also Andrew. So I think the first major barrier is poverty and insufficient resources for certain groups or segments of society, and this is within countries as well as globally across countries. And then the second major barrier, from my perspective, is a lack of political will or capture of political institutions to serve the interests of the few and powerful. And that can lead to precluding solving problems when resources should be sufficient, but they're not distributed equitably. Okay, so then that leads me to think about the solutions to those two main problems. There are lots of other problems, I'll just admit that, but I think those are the two major ones that I would highlight. And in terms of the poverty issue, so one common solution, typical solution that's discussed is technology, because technology lowers costs. And so it makes solutions more accessible to people. And that's true to a point, right? You can lower costs, but it doesn't solve the whole problem, right? Because oftentimes people are still too poor to afford those technologies. And so the second part of addressing the poverty issue is empowering people, and figuring out how to empower people by giving them opportunities to earn income, earn agency in their lives, have greater ability to act in multiple spheres. And that the problem of empowering people is a much harder problem to solve. But it requires us flipping this away from a water-centric problem to a societal problem where essentially you can tackle multiple problems by empowering people. And then on the side of political will, lack of political will or capture of political institutions, I think ultimately that the solution there has to be around collective action, and it has to be political action for policy change, but not just policy change, also institutional capacity building to allow governments and institutions to implement the policies, because you can have these great policies, but I've been in many, many countries that have fantastic policies on the books, no capacity to implement those policies. So it's following through to the institutional capacity building that is also required. And just those are general solutions, but just to make this a little bit more practical, I would say that many interventions exist that try to do exactly these sorts of things, and that many well-meaning interventions fail. And they fail for very complex reasons, some of which have to do with behavior and how people react to technology. So I'll give an example here. I was working in Andhra Pradesh, in coastal India, in rural areas, in communities where an NGO had this great idea to use a new technology, build these decentralized community treatment plants that functioned with reverse osmosis technology, great state-of-the-art technology, and households would be able to go to these kiosks and purchase this very nice clean water, and it was very cheap. Should have been affordable even in these poor rural communities. And yet what ended up happening, and what we discovered through this impact evaluation of the project, was that people, in fact, were going to these kiosks, buying water, and bringing it home. But then, because they were storing the water at home for a week at a time, the water would become recontaminated at the home. And by the time people were consuming it, all of the health benefit of that highly advanced, great technology had been dissipated, such that people were actually sicker when they were buying from these kiosks than if they were just using their original source of water. So that's a very well-meaning intervention, tries to address several of these issues, but it fails because of complex behavior, and so the details really matter. And ultimately, how you have to solve that is to get it such that people don't have to store water for long periods of time. And that requires a very convenient delivery system of that water, such that they're not spending so much time going to the place to get water, but it's available, delivered to their home, either through people who bring it to them and deliver them, or through a piped water system that is safe and effective. So that was just a practical example to illustrate that, some of the solutions that seem like they're great solutions on the surface, they're often a little bit more complicated than that.
Thank you. So we're starting to get some questions coming in. So I think we're going to try to answer some of them. And I'm just going to start with two of them right now. And I'm not sure, Andrew, if you've already provided an answer to this, but I think it would be good again. Or if others have thoughts on, what can be done to replace lead pipes, in different parts of the world, whether these are solutions that are readily available, or is it really context specific? And then I think there's another question that's really about, do we need a new paradigm in some ways, or are there different paradigms, different understandings, or different models of thinking about water, addressing water? Michele, you said, the United States doesn't have a human right to water. Other parts of the world, in different countries' constitutions, there is a human right to water. There is a human right to a clean environment. There's also different understandings of rights of nature. And, there's a large scholarship on indigenous water law. And so just wondering whether in any of your scholarship, are there other ways of addressing access to water and, how we think about justice that could be applicable? And I will let whoever wants to jump in here.
I guess I will kind of clarify the statement that I made earlier in answer to the replacing lead pipes problems. That's a problem that most major cities, most cities that are older than, 50 years old, are facing right now, is that they put in infrastructure 100 years ago, and that infrastructure takes time to build. So just to give a nice example, City of Cambridge, they have 100 miles of pipe. They need to replace that because all that pipe is 100 years old. It takes them 1 year to replace 1 mile of pipe. So in 100 years, they're going to have, again, 100 years worth of old pipe. That's a problem. The one proposed solution that my lab is trying to figure out how to work this out, both from a policy and a technological standpoint, is going back to a more distributed model of water generation, water treatment, and water storage. As Marc alluded to, there are, of course, technological challenges to storing water, right? That's why we moved away from water towers on the tops of people's houses. That's why we moved away from water storage tanks in places. We're trying to move away from that because there were technological challenges. Now we have new technology, we have new people working on these problems and trying to improve the ways in which we can store water. So we might be able to take a hybrid approach between what was working, what was not working 100 years ago, and to some new model that might actually work and fit our solutions. But right now, the process is to go through, dig up the ground, and replace a pipe. And that takes time. That takes disrupting economies because you're digging up major roadways. That takes disrupting people's houses, people's infrastructure. That requires even potentially going into people's houses and replacing that, going into school buildings and replacing pipes there. That's what I've mentioned. Boston, again, Boston City Schools, Boston Public Schools have been dealing with a lead problem since 2016. They have not replaced the piping inside those buildings because it's like, well, they feel like there's a barrier to doing that. Of course, cost is one of them. Political will is, of course, the next one, right? So that alludes to both Michele and Marc's point of really trying to push politics to move in a direction that we want it to go into. From my engineering standpoint and from the engineering world, we try to say, well, if we give more people better information, they might be able to push for these things faster, because it took proving that, so with Flint case, it took proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that there was lead in drinking water, that it was coming from the water utility before they were able to fix that problem, right? Whereas the resource-rich General Motors manufacturing plant was able to switch immediately, right? So that was a resource problem. That wasn't necessarily a technological problem. That was a combination of a resource and a technological problem. So access to resources, access to power, access to those levers of power that will help move things. the solution's not going to be a straightforward technological solution. It's not going to be that clear answer that we would love. And it's not going to be a crystal clear policy solution because we have things like the Safe Drinking Water Act that, as Michele mentioned, in 2017, it was estimated that 63 million people had consumed water from a water utility that violated EPA water quality standards. So the solution's not going to be that clear.
And I think when we talk about solutions, it's challenging because it's multi-leveled. So, for a lot of what our discussion is, we've been talking at the level of policy, right? And when I talk about the structural determinants of health, because, that's really more at the policy level of really kind of approaching, the issues as far as, power, discrimination and the distribution of resources, right? That's at the policy level. But when we're actually talking about solutions, right, this is a multi-level approach. Marc brought up the issue of behavioral interventions, right? So that's really more focusing at the individual or perhaps the community level. And that level, right, the more you know about a specific community and an individual community, or if you're targeting a group of individuals, those individuals, the more effective your intervention can be. So as part of that, some of it does come down, right? We were connecting back, I guess, to empowering, right? Also being in a position where we are having policies that addresses these inequities, but still at the same time giving enough freedom and leeway at the more, community level to allow for that flexibility. And that in itself is challenging. That's a difficult balance, but it's something that we have to be dedicated towards achieving. And, part of the thing is our current policies are not perfect. And even with our well water communities, right, and those that can't afford to be able to test their own water, we find that with well water communities, right, they have this idea that if it tastes fine, it smells fine, it looks fine, my water's fine. Right. But in all actuality, that's not necessarily the case. So, really, there's kind of that multi-pronged approach that requires, yes, we do definitely need better policy, but also to realize that, distilling information isn't enough. So in public health, right, knowledge is not enough to lead to behavioral change, right? We actually have to have a dedication of focusing on, for example, self-efficacy, right? Where someone actually believes that they can enact change. And that's where kind of those power levels come into, and being able to dedicate whatever policy we have, to be able to have that flexibility and to also be able to have the support for that individuals and communities can utilize to actually enact change. So I think those are some very important aspects to consider. And that even comes down when we think about lead pipes, right? Because Andrew was just talking about replacing lead pipe. Well, that's an important aspect of addressing, right? Elevated blood lead levels, right? To be able to address exposure to lead in water. But we also have to keep in mind, right, that whenever we are doing that, those pipes are being disturbed and you have lead being released into the water that way. So that also means that you can't just have a top-down level where you're not communicating with the communities, where you're not ensuring that they are aware of what is happening to impact their health. So it really has a mindfulness of really combining the policy and actually thinking about how those who are impacted are going to be affected. And do they have the tools and the flexibility to be able to make decisions and affect change that they need?
Marc, I don't know if you have anything you want to add there, but I if you do, I'm going to add something on, because there's another question that raises the issue of whether we need to have, tax increases. And I'm thinking more along the lines of whether we actually value water appropriately, how we price water, if there's anything you might want to add there.
Yeah, maybe I'll take a look at that comment in a minute, but I did want to take on this question of the paradigm shift also, at least just briefly.
Please. Yeah.
So this is a provocative question for sure, and I think it's worthy of much more than a 2-minute response. But my 2-minute response to it would be that we should be cautious about wanting to upend the entire paradigm, because after all, the prosperity that has been created by, some of these systems is unprecedented, right? And, if we wanted to go back to a world where, we, basically don't have a lot of the technologies that have been enabled by development and by the economic systems that we have, I think that that's sort of, asking us to sacrifice a lot of that well-being. Now, that's not saying that the system's perfect, right? Because obviously there are some groups that are left behind, and that's why we're having this discussion about inequality. And I think when we think about economics or traditional Western law as part of the problem, those are living disciplines, right? They're evolving over time, and we're constantly improving the way we think about the world. And that should continue to be a living experience. So that's my 2-minute answer to the paradigm shift question. Obviously, there need to be changes, but whether we throw out the entire system, I think is a much more fraught question. So let me take a look at this tax question.
You can also respond in the chat, or
yeah. So I guess one thing that I say, and then I'll respond to the question in the chat because I think it's a little bit different. But for a long time, actually, water is a resource that typically is not priced as a standard economic good, right? So the value or the costs of water are very different things, and how we see sort of water prices doesn't really have a lot to do with how we price most economic goods. And one of the things that economists have often said is that you should price water more accurately, and that would lead to better decision making. Obviously there are challenges to that. The fact that water gets used in all these different purposes for different purposes and uses, and so how should prices be set for those different purposes and so forth. It's not a market that's traded in it's not a good that's traded in free markets the way other things are. So a lot of complications to pricing water. But I'll take the tax question in the chat.
Thanks. Okay, so we only have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to throw out one more question, which I'm going to let you all use as your concluding remarks too. And it's not a very fair question in any way. It could be a question for another full session. But we had one question. We had a question in the chat too about, should water be a national security issue? And, it is this whole issue of securitizing our water, but also thinking about climate change as a national security issue, or like this, to the extent to which we know that, the changing climate is going to affect water availability, water access. And it's something we're all thinking about as as the next IPCC report comes out, and we've seen the last one. And we're seeing greater, inequities with water access across the world. And so in your work, how are you thinking about climate change? And as it relates to water access and, policy. So I'm going to leave that as a way to make any remaining, concluding remarks. And I will let whoever wants to go first. And
I'll jump in. So I'll jump in with the idea that we can, again, kind of predict 100 years of infrastructure. While we do have climate models that might be able to get us there, we don't have population models that can really get us there. We don't have economic models that we can say what the new thing is going to be that's going to be demanding new water. And so I don't think we can continue to rely on designing, as from a civil and environmental engineering, mechanical engineering perspective, designing these 100 years worth of infrastructure if things are changing so rapidly, right? But our policies and our engineering are built for that right now. And so we need to start thinking of different ways. That's my hope. I'm currently working on a paper. What is it? Can a Water Smart Grid? Let me grab the title of this really quickly so that you all can keep it. A Water Smart Grid to address water shortages in South Central Texas is a paper that we're working on right now. And that's the hope, is that this might be able to help with some of those changes that we're about to go through with climate change, et cetera.
Yeah, and climate change is a significant aspect of the issues as far as water is concerned. It will affect access, and the most recent IPCC report was very much focused on vulnerability and inequities. So I think that's central to whatever policies we do have to address water moving forward. And we need to think in terms of our infrastructure and preparing for climate change. And in relation to, I guess, kind of future, publications, the Environmental Law Collaborative that I'm a part of, we recently released an article entitled Adapting to a 4-Degree World that was published in the Environmental Law Review, where we do talk about the impacts of climate change and a scenario where actually we do have a 4-degree change and what that might look like.
I don't want to imagine that. Marc, do you want to have the last word, and then we will begin to wrap up?
Yeah, maybe just a quick response on climate change. I think at the end of the day, what we need in terms of solutions for climate change is quite similar to what we need for the solutions to this problem in the first place, which is more resilient, flexible, and empowered people. And in order to do that, we have to address these inequalities and sort of empower the people who don't have the ability to sort of be resilient to those shocks that are coming, because they are coming.
Gosh, thank you guys so much. Thank you, Erika, for being an amazing moderator today. To Michele, Andrew, Marc, for sharing your wisdom with us. We really look forward to having you all join us in the next session on the world of water, taking place April 5th at noon. We'll be looking at the health of the water and why quality is so important. Today's session was recorded, so if you'd like to go back and watch it, please visit our Alumni Lifelong Learning YouTube channel. We really look forward to seeing you at the next Forever Learning Institute. Thanks so much for joining.